Welcome to the Taken Hour. As you settle into your pillow and let the day fall softly behind you, take a slow breath in and a gentle breath out. If you wish for more quiet journeys like this, you are warmly invited to subscribe and let these stories return to you each night. Now, allow your body to loosen, your thoughts to drift like clouds. Tonight, we begin with a couple who longed for a child, and a child who arrived with light in his eyes. Outside, evening gathers in deep indigo layers. Inside, a lamp glows low, shadows stretch softly along the walls, and the world becomes small, safe, and slow. In this calm space, a quiet mystery unfolds, not to startle you, but to cradle you toward sleep, as distant stars watch kindly through the glass. They had waited so long that the house itself seemed to learn their patience. Every evening, they moved through the same slow rituals, closing curtains, washing cups, folding blankets, speaking in hushed tones like people inside a chapel of ordinary life. On the night, everything changed. The sky over their small town felt unusually close, its dark velvet pressed against the rooftops. A silver hush floated through the open window, carrying a silence that was not empty, but full of promise. A soft knock came at their door. When they opened it, no car waited at the curb, no stranger on the step. Only a boy, small and still, barefoot on the cool stone. His eyes shone, not brightly, but with a gentle, steady glow, like starlight found a home behind his gaze. He did not seem afraid, only tired, as though his journey had been long and very quiet. They wrapped him in a blanket that smelled of lavender and rain, and asked the questions adults believe they must ask. Where are your parents? What is your name? Are you hurt? The boy looked up at them, eyes luminous beneath his tangled hair, and spoke in a voice soft as moonlight on water. He said he did not remember other parents. He said he had been brought from the stars. He said he had been placed here, in this world, to be loved for a while. The words should have sounded strange, but in the hush of that evening, they slipped into the air like something familiar, something the house had been waiting to hear. Paperwork came later, with its lines and boxes and careful signatures, but that first night was made only of softness. They offered him warm tea, a slice of bread with honey, a place to sit close to the gentle light of the lamp. The boy held the mug with both hands, as if learning its weight, and watched the tiny swirl of steam as though it carried hidden constellations. When they asked where he had walked from, He nodded vaguely toward the dark horizon and said his path had been guided. He spoke of a quiet descent, of lights that hum without sound, of figures made only of kindness. Listening, their shoulders loosened, not from logic, but from a feeling that this child, with his calm glow, had always been meant to arrive here. When he grew sleepy, they led him down the hallway to the spare room that had been ready for years, just in case. The bed waited with its neat quilt and folded corners, a small lamp sitting like a watchful star on the bedside table. He paused at the doorway and lifted his gaze to the ceiling, as if listening to something far beyond the plaster and beams. Then he smiled, small and certain, and said this would be fine. As he lay down, he whispered that the sky could see him here, that the ones who brought him would not lose track. They drew the blanket to his chin, smoothed his hair, and stood for a long time in the doorway, watching the peaceful rise and fall of a child who spoke of galaxies as home. Night deepened. The house settled. The wind outside became a slow, even breath against the windows. In the quiet, the couple lay awake, listening, feeling the newness of another presence in their home. Their thoughts brushed against doubts and practical concerns, yet kept returning to the feeling from the doorway, as though some unseen pattern had gently clicked into place. In the guest room, the boy slept without stirring. There was a softness around him, as if sound and shadow stepped carefully not to disturb him. Far above the town, beyond the cool weight of clouds, a cluster of pale lights pulsed once, twice, like a distant heartbeat. If anyone had been watching, they might have thought it only a trick of the eyes. But the boy, even asleep, seemed to glow in answer. Morning did not erase the strangeness, but it softened it. Sunlight slid over the floorboards in long, pale ribbons. The boy sat at the table, feet not quite reaching the floor, tracing slow circles in a drop of spilled water. He watched how it caught the light and said it almost remembered where it came from. They prepared breakfast, hands moving with practiced care, as if through this simple ritual they could build a steady bridge between worlds. When they asked again about his story, he added nothing dramatic. He only repeated that he had been brought from the stars to be loved, and that in some seasons, when the air grew thin and the sky clearer, his people would look in on him to make sure the light in his eyes did not fade. They named him simply, choosing a name that felt gentle on the tongue, a word like a small shelter. With that, papers were signed, visits completed, and the world accepted its usual explanations. He had been found, they said. He had needed a home. The stars were not mentioned on forms. Yet, in the evenings, when dusk folded itself through the streets, the couple would sometimes find him standing at the back window, watching the first pinpricks of light appear. His eyes would pick up their shimmer, echo it, hold it. When asked what he saw, he answered calmly that they were only checking, only counting, only remembering that he was here. The words did not frighten them. They were spoken with such trust, it felt like being included in a larger, invisible kindness. As days and weeks slipped by, everything about life with him was almost ordinary. He laughed softly at small things, placed his toys in careful patterns, listened more than he spoke. At school, he was quiet and polite, drawing gentle spirals and distant horizons with soft crayons. Teachers described him as thoughtful, perhaps a bit dreamy. The couple watched him grow into their routines, brushing his teeth, losing socks, asking if there would be pancakes on Sunday. Only sometimes, when storms rolled in and thunder trembled across the sky, he would tilt his head as if hearing something layered beneath the sound. He would murmur that distant voices were reassuring him, that nothing was wrong, that he should rest. And then he did, curling into sleep as if wrapped by an unseen embrace. One late autumn evening, when wind combed through the trees and leaves fluttered like copper birds, they found him in the yard, standing barefoot on the cool grass. The sky was a deep, translucent blue, with a thin breath of moon hanging low. He was looking straight upward, eyes bright, hands loose at his sides. When they called his name, he answered at once, smiling. He said he was listening. Listening to what, they asked. To the spaces between, he said. To the quiet shapes moving far above, the ones who had carried him here. They were pleased. They were patient. They liked this house and the people in it. The couple felt a gentle shiver, like hearing their own names spoken kindly from a great distance, and the feeling lingered long after they went inside. Winter arrived softly that year. Snow came not in harsh storms, but in slow, quiet hours, layering the world in pale silence. The boy delighted in the way cold air tingled against his skin, how breath puffed out like cotton ghosts. Yet, even in the whiteness, his eyes held a trace of distant starlight, as though no season could quite dim it. At night, he asked if he could keep the curtains slightly open. He said the ones above liked to see that he was warm, that the people chosen for him were gentle, that the small routines of their home were calm and kind. They agreed easily, and so the window became a soft square of shared knowing, open just enough for the quiet watchers to gaze in, like grandparents looking through glass with love. Sometimes, while helping him into his coat or tying his shoes, they noticed faint marks on his shoulders and wrists. Not bruises, not scars, more like pale constellations beneath the skin. When they asked, he only smiled patiently and said those were reminders, coordinates, gentle traces left so he would not be misplaced in the vastness. He spoke the words without sadness. To him, the idea of being found again and again was comforting. They touched those patterns with careful fingers, feeling nothing unusual, just warm skin and the small heartbeat of a child. Still, on some evenings, when lamplight fell just right, the shapes seemed to kindle softly, as if answering an invisible signal brushing through the air like a quiet hymn. He never tried to prove his story. He did not speak of shining craft, nor show diagrams, nor insist. His knowing lived in the spaces between his words. When classmates spoke of rockets and cartoons, he listened kindly and said space was large enough for all their stories. At home, he sometimes placed tiny objects on the windowsill: a smooth stone, a folded drawing, a single seed. Offerings, he called them, though not in any fearful sense. Just small notes, he said, messages of gratitude, so those above would understand he was safe and not lonely. The couple began to recognize this quiet ritual as part of who he was, the way some children hum while they think. A continuous, gentle call and response between their house and the hidden sky. On certain nights, usually when the world was especially still, he would ask them to sit with him beside his bed before sleep. He liked when they simply breathed together, unhurried, the room dim, the hush unbroken. Then he would talk in small drifting sentences about places with softer gravity, where sound traveled like light, and light like music. He said he remembered fields that were not quite fields, glowing with slow, floating seeds, and tall figures made of shimmering dusk. Yet, as he spoke, he nestled closer into their familiar arms, clinging to the solidity of this home. Those memories, he said, were not meant to pull him away, only to remind him that he belonged in more than one gentle place at once. The couple found themselves changing in quiet ways. Their worries, once sharp and restless, grew rounder at the edges. Deadlines felt lighter. Arguments dissolved faster. In the presence of a child who accepted the cosmos as caring and precise, it became harder to cling to the idea of a hostile universe. They still paid bills, washed dishes, answered messages. But sometimes, pausing by the window he favored, they would look up and feel an odd, restful reassurance, as if upheld by invisible hands. If he noticed their glances, he would only nod with a small, wise calm, as though to say, "Yes, you are seen." These subtle shifts stitched themselves into their days so gently that they felt less like miracles and more like remembering how to breathe. One spring, when the air smelled of wet earth and unopened blossoms, the boy began to wake before dawn. He would pad silently to the window and stand very still, watching the sky as it lightened from ink to pearl. When they joined him, wrapped in robes, he would smile, lean into their sides, and whisper that the distance was thinner now. Not dangerous, not alarming, just thinner, like paper held to the light. They asked if that meant anything would change. He said quietly, "Not yet." For now, they only drew closer to listen. He explained it the way children explain the obvious. When someone you love is far away, sometimes you lean in, just to hear their breathing better, just to be sure they are still peacefully there. He grew, as all children do, with slow surprises. Shoes suddenly tight, sleeves too short, questions more intricate. Yet the light in his eyes never dimmed. It merely deepened, like a lantern shielded by thicker glass. Sometimes, while reading together on the couch, a faint radiance would gather around his lashes as he drifted toward sleep, as if the pages themselves reflected another, softer spectrum. He excelled at nothing in the loud, competitive ways, but moved through his days with quiet competence, kind to insects, gentle with classmates, patient with adults. The couple took a deep, settled comfort in his presence. Whatever strange path had carried him to their door, he had woven himself seamlessly into their story, like a word that had always belonged in the sentence. Only once did they see him truly troubled. It came on a summer night, pressed with heat, when the sky outside shimmered with rising air. He woke with a small sound, not a cry, more a startled breath, and sat up, hands pressed over his eyes. They reached him quickly, smoothing his hair, asking if he was ill. He shook his head, saying the connection had flared too brightly for a moment, like a whisper suddenly close to his ear. They had simply looked in on him very carefully, wanting to be sure he was still cherished, still chosen, still protected. It had been overwhelming, but not unkind. As he calmed, his shoulders loosened, and he lay back down, guided by their familiar touch, back into easy sleep. After that, he asked if they would teach him more about this world, so he could share it back when the time came. Not urgently, not as a deadline, but as a promise. They taught him names of trees, the flavors of herbs in their small kitchen garden, the comfort of rain against a roof. He learned how bread rose patiently in a warm bowl, how cats trusted slow hands, how rivers sounded different in the evening than in the morning. All these details he stored carefully, as though weaving a tapestry of sensations. At night, he sometimes whispered them toward the glass, the smell of toast, the feeling of a bandaged knee, the sound of someone humming while folding laundry. Gifts of ordinary tenderness to carry into the vast beyond. Years did not rush. They unfolded. The couple stopped counting how long it had been since the knock at the door. The memory of their first bewilderment softened into something like a sacred joke shared with the universe. They had expected complexity, but what they were given was simple. Wake up, make tea, listen, hold, reassure. In quiet moments, one of them would say, half smiling, that if this was an arrangement with distant travelers, it was the gentlest sort of pact. The boy, now older, would look up from his book and say, they were right. None of this was meant to disturb. It was only meant to mingle two forms of love, so that when paths parted again someday, they would not feel like strangers to each other's skies. One crisp evening in early autumn, as the first chill threaded itself through the air, the boy suggested they sit outside after dinner. They carried blankets and a thermos of tea to the backyard, where shadows grew long and the sky slowly brightened with stars. He lay back on the grass between them, head resting near their hands, eyes reflecting faint points of light. He began to name a few of them, not in any language they knew, but in sounds that flowed softly like low music. He said those were places where kindness had taken root, where journeys ended gently. The couple listened, their breathing gradually matching the slow rhythm of his words. The earth cool beneath them, the sky vast above, all distance feeling unusually tender. As nights grew longer, subtle changes began. The boy's eyes, once only softly bright, started to catch the light in unfamiliar ways. A lamplight reflection might linger a heartbeat too long. In photographs, his gaze seemed tipped with pale halos. None of it felt eerie. It was like watching the moon wax a little fuller. He did not withdraw. On the contrary, he seemed more present than ever, laughing quietly, helping with chores, brushing crumbs from the table with gentle precision. When asked, he said that sometimes, as seasons turn, certain lights prepare themselves, not to burn, not to blind, but to be easier to see from far away. He told them it was nothing to fear, only a sign that all promises were still being kept. One night, rain tapped softly on the roof while they played a slow board game at the dining table. Candles flickered, their flames bending in quiet agreement with the breeze. The boy paused mid-move and tilted his head, as if listening to a call carried in water. He smiled then, not suddenly, but like dawn expanding. He looked at them with affection so deep it felt like a tide. They asked, gently, what he had heard. He answered that they were asking if he was ready, somewhere far above the layers of cloud. His reply, he said, was simple, not yet. There was still warmth to memorize, rain songs to recall, the exact look of their hands when reaching for one another across a table. Time, respectful of their unspoken wishes, continued to stroll instead of race. The boy grew taller. His voice deepened slightly, carrying the same measured calm. Some evenings, he helped with cooking, standing at the stove, stirring slowly, inhaling the steam as though preserving each scent carefully. When steam fogged the window, he would draw tiny star shapes with his fingertip, then swipe them away before they fully formed. When questioned playfully, he said it was not time to leave marks. These were rehearsal sketches, reminders to himself. He was not anxious. Neither were they. Not exactly. They lived as people do, under a distant appointment, trusting that when the day came, it would arrive as gently as the child himself once had. Occasionally, subtle hints appeared that others had begun to notice something unusual, though they could not name it. A neighbor mentioned that the boy's eyes seemed to catch the stars more than most. A teacher remarked on his unshakable serenity during storms and drills. An old woman at the market, with hands like folded paper, met his gaze and nodded as if recognizing a familiar traveler. Each time, he responded with gratitude and ordinary politeness, never trying to dazzle, never seeking attention. In private, he told the couple that recognition simply meant their world was gently adjusting around him, like fabric settling around a carefully placed stone. Nothing would tear, nothing would break. It was all part of the quiet choreography of being both guest and family. One clear winter night, the sky above their town turned unusually crystalline. Stars shone with a focused, delicate brightness, as if closer by a fraction. The boy asked if they might drive beyond the streetlights, out where the dark was fuller. They agreed, wrapping themselves in coats and scarves, the car humming gently as it carried them into the open fields. There, they stepped out onto frost-silvered grass. The cold nipped softly at their noses, but the sky seemed to lean down to meet them. The boy stood between them, his hands tucked into theirs, and whispered greetings so faint they felt more than heard. He was introducing them, he explained, as one introduces beloved hosts to distant guests. He pointed to a pale cluster of lights, saying that once, long ago, and not long ago, he had looked outward from there, imagining a life with hands that baked bread and windows that rattled in the wind. Another point of light, he said, held oceans that glowed beneath their own clouds, where he had drifted as a smaller spark. But this place, this quiet corner, with its kettle and worn rug and sleepy plants on the sill, had called to him. It was chosen as a safe harbor, and they had agreed. Those above did not steal or command, they invited. And he, even as something more than human, had wanted to know the exact weight of an embrace after a long day. The drive back was hushed. Headlights sweeping gently over sleeping houses. In the soft pool of dashboard light, the boy's profile looked older, thoughtful, but utterly at peace. At home, while they prepared for bed, he moved from room to room, touching familiar objects: a chipped mug, a frayed cushion, a photograph frame. It felt less like farewell and more like blessing each detail. When they asked if something was imminent, he shook his head. Not tonight. But soon, in the language of stars, meant something broad and slow. He promised that whenever the line was crossed, it would not shatter their nights. It would feel like a door opening to a wider room, while this home remained intact within it. As months unfolded, they found themselves practicing a kind of inward stillness. Not denial, not dread, rather a readiness to honor what might come. Sometimes, sitting in the living room with curtains half drawn, they would close their eyes and imagine their home as seen from afar, a small dot of warmth against a dark canvas. In those moments, they sensed with surprising clarity that something out there appreciated their efforts. Every mended tear in his clothes, every gentle answer to his unusual questions, every time they chose patience instead of sharpness. The boy, passing through, would rest a hand briefly on each shoulder, an anchor and a bridge, and the room would feel aligned with something vast and benevolent. One dusk, a faint shimmer appeared high above the town, barely noticeable against the early stars. It was less a light and more a gentle rearranging of darkness, as though someone had drawn a thin, luminous line and then erased it. Birds did not panic, Dogs did not bark. The world continued its small routines. Only the boy glanced up with a knowing softness. Inside, while setting the table, he paused for a breath, then continued. Later, he explained that this was merely a reminder, an itinerary checked, a path traced, a promise reaffirmed. They were making sure there would be no confusion when the time arrived, that he would not be taken from the wrong door, nor from unwilling arms. He reassured them gently. Departure, when it came, would not be theft. They had never been meant to lose him as punishment. Instead, it would be an unfolding, like hands opening to reveal something that had always been there. He spoke of overlapping circles, their world, his origin, intersecting in this brief, luminous span. They asked if he would remember them. He looked almost surprised by the question. "Remember you?" he echoed. "You are the reason for the journey. You are the story I was sent to carry back. The nights you soothed me, the meals you shared, the patience you chose. These are the coordinates they value most." His words settled over them like a soft blanket, heavier with meaning, but comforting. In the final year, before everything changed, daily life became almost translucent with appreciation. They noticed tiny details as if illuminated from within. The creak of the third stair, the chipped blue bowl he always chose, the way morning light touched his hair. He volunteered at the library, stacked chairs after events, helped neighbors carry groceries. People said he was a good young man, thoughtful and steady. No one guessed how literally he carried other worlds in his silence. At home, he continued his offerings on the windowsill, now smaller, more symbolic. A thread, a feather, a page from a notebook with 3 carefully written words, "I am loved." He smiled as he placed it, sure that someone far above could read it perfectly. And then, without warning, yet without shock, the evening arrived. It was late summer, warm but not stifling, air humming with distant insects. They had finished dinner, washed dishes, left the window ajar to let in the scent of grass. The boy, now on the threshold between youth and adulthood, stood suddenly still. His posture changed, not tense, but attentive, like someone hearing their name called from across a gentle river. He turned to them with eyes brighter than they had ever seen, not blazing, but clear, deep, full of layered reflections. "It is time," he said softly. But his voice held no finality, only an invitation. He asked them to step outside with him into the mild embrace of the night. They stepped into the yard together. Above, The sky had gathered itself into a quiet spectacle, a broad, pale arc of luminescence spanning the town, so delicate that anyone not looking carefully might dismiss it as imagination. Within that arc, faint points drifted like lanterns on a distant sea. The world did not quake, no sirens sang. Insects continued their rhythmic chorus. The boy took one of each of their hands. He thanked them, using words and silences both. He said they had given him everything needed to answer the questions of those who had sent him. He said they had proven that tenderness, given freely, could anchor even a wandering light so completely that leaving would feel like expanding, not escaping. They asked, with voices steady but thick, what it would mean. Would he vanish? Would they forget him? He shook his head, smiling with the kind of certainty that makes fear politely step aside. He explained that to those above, distance did not undo connection. He would shift, that was all. Parts of him that shimmered quietly would align again with their source, while the parts shaped by this home, his love of warm bread, his trust in touch, his habit of leaving books open on safe pages, would remain woven into their days. They would not lose him in a sharp, jagged cut, but feel him like a second warmth in every lamplight, a familiar echo in every peaceful night. As he spoke, a gentle radiance unfolded around him, as if the light in his eyes had seeped outward to outline his shape. It did not blind them, instead, it clarified. They saw in him a layering of selves, the sleepy child clutching a mug, the small boy in the snow, the thoughtful student, the steadfast helper, and something else that had always been there, patient and immense. Their sorrow rose, but so did a profound calm. He asked them to close their eyes and place their hands over his. They did, feeling only familiar warmth. Above, the pale arc brightened for a moment, like a held breath, a door gently easing open on silent hinges. He told them, in that suspended breath, that love does not choose between earth and stars. It travels. It translates. It finds shapes that fit. He said if they ever wished to speak to him, they needed only to sit together in the quiet and look kindly at the sky, or at a single candle flame, or at the steam rising from their tea. He would be there, not as absence, but as widened presence. The light around him pulsed once, in time with their heartbeats, gentle and vast. Then, With no sound more dramatic than leaves shifting, it thinned. When they opened their eyes, he still stood before them, but something in the air suggested that his path now extended far beyond their yard. The change did not rip him away. It unfolded gradually over the following days, like dawn exploring corners of a room. He remained with them, laughed with them, ate at their table. Yet there were moments when his outline seemed almost translucent at the edges, especially under starlight. He began to sleep less, not from restlessness, but because he said he could rest while awake, somewhere between their world and another. He was never frightening, never distant. In fact, he was tenderer than ever, attentive to their smallest moods, thanking them often with quiet sincerity. They understood, without agreeing on the words, that he now belonged fully to both realms at once, stitching them together with his continued presence. One evening, while they read in the living room, the atmosphere shifted with surprising sweetness. The world outside dimmed into a deep, velvety blue, and the sky beyond the window brimmed with softly aligned lights, like an audience taking their seats in respectful silence. The boy, no longer just boy, not yet entirely other, set his book aside. He said the journey was, at last, ready to complete its circle. They felt their throats tighten, but he took their hands and guided them to sit. He reminded them of warm mornings, snowfalls, market days, shared jokes. He said every one of those moments had been seen and cherished by those who waited above, and that no gratitude was large enough to measure what they had given. Then came the gentlest part. He asked them to do what they had done the very first night. Stand at a doorway and watch him sleep. They went with him to his room, which had grown with him over the years, but still held echoes of the small bed and lamp. He lay down, fully clothed, eyes bright and peaceful. The air hummed faintly, like a lullaby too deep for ears. He told them that, when he closed his eyes, a path would open that his waking form no longer needed to walk. Part of him would rise, carrying all that he had gathered here. Another part would remain, the part shaped by their care, to linger as a quiet presence in their home. He asked them not to be alarmed by what they saw next. He promised again there would be no violence, no emptiness. He closed his eyes. The lines of his face relaxed into something ageless. A pale shimmer rose above his resting form, like breath turned to light. Within that shimmer, impressions stirred. Their faces, their laughter, the front door on that first night, the windowsill offerings, the folded laundry, the sound of rain. The arc in the sky outside answered with a soft deepening of brightness. They watched, tears slipping silently, but their hearts did not fracture. When the shimmer finally drifted upward, vanishing through roof and cloud without disturbing a tile, his body remained sleeping, breathing quietly, as if he had simply fallen into a profound, tender dream. In the days that followed, he woke and moved, almost ordinarily. Yet something ineffable had lightened. He belonged unmistakably to this house, and also beyond it. Birds seemed to pause on the fence when he stepped outside. Night winds flowed around him like respectful guests. He confirmed softly that the journey was complete. What needed to be carried back had departed, cradled in careful hands of light. But he, shaped by their choices and shared time, was allowed to stay as long as their lives unfolded, now not just as child, but as a bridge. They had not lost him. They had gained a quiet embassy between their kitchen table and the wide, listening sky. Nights changed flavor. When they looked up, the stars felt closer, their patterns somehow kinder. Once, while they drank tea by the window, the youth, who still laughed at forgotten mittens and burned toast, pointed to a small, steady light low on the horizon. "There," he said simply, "that is where they keep the memory of this home. Every time you choose gentleness over haste, it brightens a little. Every time you rest instead of worrying yourself into knots, they take note." The couple smiled, surprised by how easily they believed him. The universe, they realized, might be keeping score not of grand achievements, but of quiet mercies and softened voices. Wordlessly, they began to live as though their home were bilingual, speaking both the language of laundry and appointments, and the language of starlight and subtle signals. They still argued at times, but quicker to apologize, feeling an unseen audience nod in approval when tempers cooled. They still fretted about money, but let comfort have more weight than panic. The youth moved through it all with patient humor, reminding them with a glance or a touch on the shoulder that they had already been recognized, their goodness recorded not on paper, but in the quiet archive above. Some evenings, the sky offered a soft confirmation, a slow-moving light that paused over their roof before melting into the greater dark. They never held grand ceremonies. No one built a monument. The story of the boy at their door remained mostly their own, told only in fragments, if at all. Yet, in small ways, its glow spread. Neighbors felt calmer after visiting, Children liked playing in their yard, saying it felt safe, as if someone invisible was making sure no one tripped too hard. On certain nights, strangers passing by glanced up at their window and slowed, sensing something they could not name. The couple took these ripples as gentle proof that their arrangement with the stars continued, wrapped in ordinary evenings and simple hospitality. As years advanced, their bodies grew slower. Joints ached. Steps shortened. The youth, steady and luminous in spirit, if not in any dramatic way, supported them with unassuming ease, carrying groceries, adjusting pillows, making tea with the same care they once showed him. They sometimes wondered aloud what would happen when their days ended. He answered gently that nothing beloved was ever dropped. Just as they had once been trusted with him, someone, somewhere, whether of flesh or of light, would be trusted with them. He promised that, if allowed, he would stand at the same doorway for them that they had once stood in for him. Sometimes, late, when the house was quiet and breathing slowly, one of them would wake and find the youth sitting by the window in the dark. His eyes would be open, reflecting countless tiny lights that did not match any visible stars. When asked softly what he saw, he replied that he was checking arrivals, small lights from other corners of existence, making sure everyone found their doors, their families, their gentle resting places. It was work done without fanfare, like folding linens. They would nod, reassured, and drift back to sleep, knowing that even in hours they could not manage, someone they loved watched over strangers, guided by lessons learned at their own table. On an evening of particular stillness, when air and sky felt made of the same hushed fabric, he invited them to sit beside him, all three lined up at the window. He explained that long ago, before he was placed in their care, there had been doubts among those who sent him. Doubts about whether hearts could hold what they hoped, whether a borrowed child with a quiet glow would be met with fear, curiosity, or love. He said their life together had answered those questions more beautifully than anyone had dared to predict. The ark they sometimes glimpsed was not a ship, he clarified now, but a listening curve, a shape of attention bent kindly toward them. He told them that, in another measure of time, their story was often retold. About the house with open curtains, the kitchen of steady meals, the patient arms that made room for a child who spoke of stars. It was used as encouragement for others pondering similar journeys, proof that tenderness could be trusted. Hearing this, they did not feel grand. They felt small in a comfortable way, like a candle in a deep room, not lighting everything, but enough. Sleep crept at the edges of their thoughts as he spoke. The rhythm of his voice, the familiar surroundings, and the soft presence beyond the glass worked together like a long, slow exhale. As their lives neared their natural, quiet horizon, nothing theatrical occurred. No thunder, no trumpets of sky. The youth remained by them, aging only subtly, his eyes steady. When, at last, one of them slipped away in sleep, it happened on a night softened by gentle rain. The remaining two sat near the bed, one of earth and one of stars. The youth placed his hand over both theirs, closed his eyes, and listened. After a while, he whispered that the journey had been received, the light carried safely, the love catalogued tenderly where it would never be smudged. Grief came, but it was wrapped in assurance. There were hands beyond hands, doors beyond doors. When the second of them followed, some seasons later, the house did not feel emptied. It felt fuller, as though saturated with layers of remembered evenings. The youth, who now seemed ageless without troubling the eye, kept the rooms in order, the plants watered, the curtains adjusted for sun and starlight. Some believed the house abandoned. Others swore they saw someone moving through it at odd hours, a figure gentle and composed. Those who occasionally met his gaze at the gate felt suddenly rested, as if they had slept well for the first time in months. Above, the quiet arc still appeared now and then, thinner but constant, like a smile no longer needing explanation. In time, new families came. Doors opened and closed. Children's voices echoed. Furniture changed. Through it all, he remained, for a while, lightly present, like a guardian woven into the grain of the wood. He helped in ways unnoticed, a lost object found easily, a bad dream soothed, a dangerous misstep avoided. At certain windows, late at night, a small figure with luminous eyes could be glimpsed gazing upward, conferring silently with hidden companions above. The story of the strange, kind house became local folklore. People called it blessed without knowing why. The truth, as always, was quiet. Once, love had been tested here, and had answered so gently that the cosmos kept listening. Eventually, his path led him onward too. One evening, long after anyone remembered the couple by name, he stood alone in the yard. The sky called with a familiar softness. He looked back at the windows that had once framed their faces, now framing others, and thanked the house, the street, the garden. Then, without spectacle, he stepped forward, and his form grew thinner against the night, like breath fading on glass. A pale shimmer rose, met by that enduring arc above. Yet part of him, shaped irrevocably by sturdy walls and soft blankets and murmured reassurances, remained folded into the place, a kindness embedded permanently in its foundations. From that time on, travelers who passed through the town sometimes chose that house without knowing why. Those who slept under its roof reported unusually restful dreams of gentle lights descending, not with fear, but with affection, of doors opening onto wider rooms that still smelled like familiar kitchens, of children with luminous eyes laughing softly. Above, the watchers continued their patient orbit, now guided by the story he had carried back, proof that in one small corner of one small world, a child with light in his eyes had been welcomed without needing to dim. And so, on nights when you lie awake and gaze at the sky, you might feel it too, the sense that far away, someone is quietly grateful for the way you hold the light you're given.